The session today is about understanding how addiction affects families. And so, excuse me, I came across some material that I used to use, and this is a long time ago, when I was actually doing lectures in family therapy in recovery programs. I came up with a couple of these sheets. I'd forgotten about these, but I ran across them. I must have saved them. I had a whole carton of material that I used to use, and I got rid of it when I retired, but I saved a few that had artwork on it. So that's where these came from. I had a heck of a time finding them, but I did find them, come up with them. But let's start with the one that has a mobile on it. And it says family systems. Because we used family systems theory in treatment of chemical dependency when we were working with families. And so the idea of one way to explain family systems theory is to think of a mobile. And I don't know that we see them very often anymore, but yes.
I know that this is interrupting, but
go ahead.
Yvonne has asked me to ask us to all pray for her. I've written down stuff. 20 years ago she had a heart implant thing, like a pacemaker. 10 years ago she had to put had to replace the batteries, because that's how long it takes. So
Yes. You do worry at 91. It's just a little tougher to come back from things. Back to the idea of a mobile. I don't know that we see them very often anymore, but it's a form of abstract art with brightly colored pieces of metal or whatever, and they're put into a structure so that they have a balance. I think Calder was the artist that made them popular. Some of his were big, great big. And so that when the wind would blow, the things would move, but because it was in a balance, it always returned to a certain equilibrium. And that's the model that family systems theory uses to figure out how and why families behave the way they do. And so the idea would be that whole is more than the sum of its parts. When you put people together in a particular structure, something happens in that group. We saw that with group therapy being the primary mode of treatment that we like to use with chemical dependency. Something really healthy and creative can happen in a group, and it's more than just the sum of the various parts. So families are like that. Turning to the second one here, there's a word on top of the page called homeostasis. Oddly enough, that showed up in the trivia page of the journal world this morning because it was talking about biology. So biological systems have homeostasis. For example, our body temperature. Our bodies work to maintain a constant temperature. If we get overheated, the body works to bring that down. If we get too cold, the body works to bring that back up. So I put that little thermostat up in the corner of the page. Like if you have one of those fancy programmable thermostats, which I had to get rid of mine because I couldn't figure out how to work it. I just got a simple one. If I want air, I push the air. If I want heat, I push the heat. But the fancy ones are like that thermometer. You can set it so that if it gets above, I don't know, 75, 76, the air comes on. If it gets below 68 or whatever you set, then the heat comes on. So family systems theory suggests that in the structure of a family, there is that same type of balance that works to keep things at a certain equilibrium. Now, if you imagine a mobile and you clip like a clothespin on one piece of that mobile, what happens to the mobile?
Well,
It becomes out of whack. And every other piece of the structure is affected. I mean, some are drawn, if the clothespin or the weight pulls one piece down, another piece has to go up. And every other piece in the system finds a way of reacting until there is a new balance that gets set. And the problem is that, if you take the clothespin off, the mobile will immediately reset itself. That's the homeostasis thing working. But if you have chemical dependency in a family, And I'm kind of thinking of the stereotypical case where you've got a husband who's the alcoholic and the wife who's the codependent, which we'll get to in a minute. If that dynamic exists for 10, 15, 20 years, and he then gets sober, what we find is that the system doesn't reset automatically. It has been set at an unhealthy place for so long that now the family probably needs some work as well. So, and I think I gave a stereotypical example of, in circular causality, they talk about feedback loops, where people get caught in patterns of behavior that nobody likes, but they don't really know how to break the pattern. So, the stereotypical one, the husband is the alcoholic, the wife nags, so he comes home, she nags, he drinks. It's just a pattern that has developed over the years. It's so set and ingrained that he comes home one night and he doesn't really even intend on drinking. She nags him anyway, just because that's the system now. And so he says, well, if you're going to nag me, I'll drink. And it's not that her nagging causes the drinking. In fact, it makes a really handy excuse for him. He'll say, well, if you didn't nag me every night when I get home from work, I wouldn't have to drink. Well, that's not true. He would drink because he's dependent. Anyway, that pattern gets stuck. And so with family systems theory, we're trying to enable a family to look at all of that, the whole system. And the beauty of that is there's no one to blame. There's no blame in systems theory. So you don't blame the alcoholic or the chemically dependent person, which is the typical. In fact, the blame is probably now built into the structure, if you take my meaning. So the beauty of this theory is you don't have to blame anybody. You just look at the system. And the therapist sits down with the family and says, all right, what can we change that will work better for you, that will be more comfortable, that will be healthier? And so the blaming is taken out of the picture, which really helps everyone look at how to get better rather than just focusing on the problems. So we should probably talk about codependency. Have you ever heard that term before? Okay, so that's not brand new to you. I'm using a definition that is kind of narrowly focused on chemical dependency, but codependency exists in other situations as well. But for the sake of addictions recovery, I'm saying that a codependent person has an unhealthy obsession with trying to control another person's drinking or using. Okay? So
repeat, please. Say it again, please.
It's on the sheet.
that's all right,
okay,
but
okay,
codependency is an unhealthy obsession with trying to control another person's drinking or using. So if you imagine the chemically dependent person, well, imagine it this way. Here is the drug of choice. Let's say it's alcohol. Okay, here is the alcoholic. The alcoholic's life comes to revolve more and more around the drug of choice. So now he's avoiding people that don't drink, he's spending too much time at the bar, whatever, the stereotypical kind of thing. His focus comes to be more and more on the drug of choice. How to obtain it, how to use it, how to get over the negative results of using it, how to find another dose. And what he finds through bitter experience is that he's powerless. He attempts to control, but he can't. So he can't control his use of the drug. Now you just back that up one stage, and here you've got a close relative. In this stereotypical example, it's the wife. Her life comes to revolve more and more around trying to control his drinking. She's going to fix him, or straighten him out, or use whatever means she can come up with to try and get him to stop. So her focus now is more and more on him. So she, as this goes on long enough over the years, she loses social contacts, other activities, interests, hobbies, because where is her life focused now? On trying to control this guy's drinking. And what she discovers through bitter experience is she's powerless. She can't control his drinking. She tries, but she fails. So that's I guess the primary way of looking at codependency in terms of addiction. Now, here's an interesting thing. Many of us in the helping professions have some of this. We have some characteristics of codependency, if we're honest. And it's pretty important to be honest about it. We enjoy, or it's meaningful to us to help people. We like to see people grow. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're aware of it. And that's why I think for pastors it's so extremely important for a pastor to have a self-care routine and a support network, and ideally that support network would be outside of the congregation. So he or she has support and friendships and relationships and interests and activities that are independent of the church, so that she can be, I guess you're the most helpful when you're the most healthy yourself. So you need that self-focus and self-awareness to be a good therapist or counselor or pastor. And so I hope that's making some sense. Too much focus on the self. And I think I put a sentence in here about a codependent person assumes responsibility for the person he or she is trying to help. So if I'm codependent and my loved one is alcoholic, I'm going to work her program for her, or try to. Of course, that doesn't work. It's much more healthy when we find ways to be responsible to the people we love, if they're chemically dependent, or not, whatever that is. So I pulled some symptoms of chemical dependency off of the internet. And from WebMD, compulsive attention to someone else, fear of abandonment is a key issue. A lot of times, folks who are in relationship with an alcoholic or an addict have trouble really enforcing their, they try to set limits but can't enforce them. If you keep drinking, I'm going to kick you out, or you have to leave. But they find they can't carry through because they're really afraid of abandonment. Don't know how to live without that person in their life.
No, that's true, that's true.
Lack of external support systems, an enmeshed sense of self. That means if I'm codependent, then my identity is all wrapped up in my loved one that I'm trying to help. I forget who I am. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm so tied in with, or enmeshed with another person. Self-doubt, and then at the end of that list, resentment. If you think about it, you love somebody, you're trying to take care of them over the course of 10, 15 years in some cases. Everything you've tried has failed. You have had to assume more and more responsibility because your loved one is disabled by the drinking or the drug use. So you're doing the banking, you're doing the shopping, you're doing the yard, you're doing the car, you're doing everything. Sooner or later, how are you going to feel? Used. Yeah, resentful. So that's one of the dynamics you need to work on in family recovery. And that brings us to enabling behaviors. And I want to make sure that this doesn't sound like criticism. I'm not criticizing anybody when we describe enabling behavior. I really have my heart goes out to people who are caught in families where this kind of thing is going on. The last thing I would want to do is make them feel worse than they already do. So it's not criticism, it's description. So some examples of enabling behavior would be making excuses. Well, he drinks because he's really busy at work and all that pressure. He just needs to let off some steam. Removing or managing negative consequences of someone's drinking or drug use. So bailing them out of jail for a DUI. Financing, giving them money when they're out of money because they've spent it on drugs, but now they don't have money for rent or for whatever, and so you're helping, quote unquote, by providing resources there. Repeatedly believing promises despite the other person's failure to keep them. You're just kind of stuck in that feedback loop and can't seem to get out of it. Making threats or setting limits but not carrying them out. Or from Healthline, that first list was mine. The second one is similar. Ignoring or tolerating problematic behavior, providing financial assistance, covering, making excuses, taking on more than your share of responsibilities, avoiding the issue, brushing things off, denying the problem, sacrificing or struggling to recognize your own needs. So one of the key issues in helping an addict recover involves allowing the alcoholic to be responsible for his or her own recovery, while refocusing on one's own, working one's own program, getting back in touch with one's own wants and needs, and rebuilding a healthy social network, rebuilding friendships that maybe had been lost over the years with the preoccupation with the addiction in the family, maybe covering up the shame of that, just withdrawing. So getting them back engaged in things that support them and that they enjoy. And there are resources. Family members are not alone in finding help. There is Al-Anon, which is the 12-step group for close relatives of alcoholics, family members of alcoholics. Nar-Anon, if the focus is more on drugs, Nar-Anon might be a better fit. There are groups like Adult Children of Alcoholics, Codependents Anonymous, and probably others that I don't even know about. I have to admit, I can't remember exactly the timeline, but I did work as a family therapist for a period of time. And I actually found it more difficult working with families because they don't see themselves as the identified problem. And of course they're angry and resentful by the time you get them into treatment. And it was difficult to get family members to commit to a 12-step recovery program. That's for the alcoholic. He's the drunk. I'm not going to a 12-step group and sharing my stuff with anybody, a bunch of strangers. That's the kind of response you would get. So there's a resistance, and I'm not criticizing, I'm just describing. It makes sense, but it's a challenge to get family members sometimes to really work on themselves. In all the years, I think about my 15-year pastorate in St. Albans, I did some short-term counseling with families that had addiction issues, and of course I would be referring them to places where they could get the intensive kind of help they would need. You really can't do that as a pastor. It's too personal, and they need more help than a pastor has time to give. So I would be referring them out, and I only had, in that 15 years, I had a grand total of one woman who went to Al-Anon, and she did really well. She had 2 sons. I think at least one of them was drinking heavily, and she was just torn up, as you would be. And I think he eventually got some help too, but she went to Al-Anon and just kind of blossomed. She got back into her own things, and it was really fun to watch that whole recovery process.
I need to tell you something before you.
So, okay, that's basically the lecture. So if we could turn the camera off now, and let's see where you all want to go with discussion.